And the Rash says in the 5th chapter, Mishnah Aleph of Shmita, of Shvius, and the Gra says that it's only prohibited to use the Shmita produce itself, but we don't decree on the other fruit that we worry we'd mix it up with the other fruit. So therefore, you have to make some type of like tying some type of thread or put a splinter of some type in the fruit that started developing during Shmita year. So you know those are the Shmita year. But then the ones that don't have this sign that you were meticulous in marking, you could eat them. You know that they're not Shmita produce, you could eat them regularly. And the Turei and the Shagas Aryeh says that certain types of figs, I guess Persian figs, that some take 2 years to develop. If we know for sure that these were blossomed in the Shmita year, you're not allowed to use them in the next year, but there's a difference between them and the Beno Shuach, these white figs that we're talking about. Because these Beno Shuach, in general, we say in general, we know that their Shmita produce is in the 2nd year of the Shmita process, of the Shmita cycle. But these Persian figs, we don't necessarily say that we have to worry about them in the 1st year of the Shmita cycle. Rather, we just assume that they developed after Shmita, because there are some places that do finish them in 1 year. But if you know for sure that the fruit that are on the trees are from Shmita, then you're not allowed to use them in the 1st year of the cycle, meaning the 8th year. So these Beno Shuach are a certain type of white fig. So the Shagas Aryeh says that there's some type of fig, some type of Persian fig, that we know it takes them 2 years to ripen. Probably not, because nowadays also the rule of thumb is they only grow things that they could do quickly. Even the chickens that we have, they mix whatever different certain breeds so that they know that after like 48 days, they're gonna slaughter it, and it doesn't pay to feed it longer than that. So they made the chickens a certain breed, so they know they're only going to keep it a certain length. So they wouldn't do something that it would take 2 years to ripen, because then they wouldn't have as much stuff to sell. But also, Persian figs from Persia wouldn't be a problem. It's only a problem if they grew in Israel. And later in this parak, we're gonna talk about where in Eretz Yisrael is the Shmita, the boundaries of Shmita, the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael for Shmita. And who's this? I don't know who he's quoting right here. That the Chachamim didn't distinguish for since the majority of Persian figs develop in only 1 year, we don't have to worry about the variety that takes 2 years for them to ripen. So now, in regard to the Beno Shuach, these white figs that so the fruits that have the sanctity of Shmita are edible 2 years later, we could say, it's possible to say, that what do you do about the biur? Do you have to do biur? So he says, first he says, we don't find that anything has a biur after certain times in the 8th year, because what? Oil and wine, and I forgot what the third thing is the latest biur. And those are all, so again, biur is, if it's not available for the wild animals in the fields, it's not available for us. And according to the Rambam, there's 3 main opinions in biur. According to the Rambam, you have to destroy it after that time. According to the Ravid, first, when it's not available in your cities, you have to declare it ownerless, but then people could retrieve it and still eat it. And then once it's not available in the fields, they have to destroy it. And the Ramban's Shita, which is the Shita that everyone paskins like, is that when the biur happens, you have to declare it ownerless, but then anyone could reclaim it. You could even reclaim your own thing after declaring it ownerless when no one's in hearing distance of you declaring them ownerless. So he says we should say that you do have to do beer, but some have a doubt and they say that there is no beer for them because it only makes sense to say beer that when it's during the year of Shmitta. So for vegetables, it would be during Shmitta itself, for most vegetables, and for fruits, it would be sometime during the 8th year, because they had to start growing during Shmitta, and by the time they're ripened and ready to be consumed, it's already the and some have a doubt that the beer would only work when it's within Shmita. Since this is so unusual, it's a couple years later, there would be no beer. So Rav Kook seems to conclude that since they grow every year, but they stay on the tree for 3 years from the time that they start developing until they're fully grown, so they're considered that they never, the tree is never bare of them. So there's no beer applicable to this species. Since the tree, even though this year's crop is done, there's still more things developing on the tree. So there's no beer at all. The Mishnah Rishona says that Beno Shuach are a very, they're a bad quality of figs, but that's in the 2nd year because they're edible, but they're not so good, and they have sanctity of Shmita. But he says if they would have fallen off the tree early, or if someone improperly removed them from the tree, because you're not allowed to waste Shmita produce, so then there is no Shmita Kedusha to the fruit at all. But the Persian Te'inim are a better quality, and you're able to, and they're much more edible even before they're fully ripe. So even if the ones that take 2 years and you find them done at the beginning of the 8th year, that you do treat them with Kedusha Shvius, because they're not as a low quality as Beno Shuach. So it's a little bit strange. We're going to see that there's not in this parak though, that there's different rules about esrog. Now, one of the things about esrog, the Torah calls esrog creates hadar. So we translate it's the fruit of a beautiful tree, or depending where you put the comma, fruit of a tree which is beautiful. But the Gemara has a bunch of drashos about esrogim, and one of that is that hadar means that lives. Like a dira is an apartment. Diurin in the Lashon Mishnah means living furnishings, like a bed and table, things like that. So it's called Priyetz Hadar because it can live on the tree for multiple years. So I guess it's a little different than the Beno Shuach, because Beno Shuach ripen at a certain time. But the thing about esrogim is that esrogim ripen, and then you could leave them on the tree. So that's why esrogim have a slightly it's a machlokas rishona, a machlokas tanaim in the Mishnah about whether because unlike other trees and Beno Shuach is an exception and esrog is a different exception, but they're not the same type of exception. An esrog could have been on the tree for multiple years, so you have to just treat it for meiser and truma the way of when you picked it, like it's a vegetable, even though it's really a tree. Because so what we're saying here is that there's a distinction between Beno Shuach. I mean, he's not saying it, but we have to say there's a distinction between Beno Shuach and esrog, because Beno Shuach takes 3 years to ripen. So obviously, until they ripen, they stay on the tree. So it seems that the 3rd year, at the end of 3rd year, they're not on the tree anymore, because it would be like any other fruit that's overripe. It's going to just fall off the tree. Whereas esrogim, they ripen in 1 year, and once they're ripe, they can stay on the tree. So even though Beno Shuach and esrogim have a similar thing about multiple years being on the tree at the same time, they're different because the Beno Shuach take 3 years to ripen. So there's different years worth of produce on the tree, but when that year is done, it falls off and it's no good anymore. But an esrog ripens in 1 year, and then that good fruit that can stand the tree for several years and still stay good. Yud Zayin. Habitzolim hasrisim b'kol mitzri. So non-seeding onions, meaning they're not able to reproduce, so it doesn't have seeds. Upula mitzri and the Egyptian bean. So there's different types of Egyptian beans we talk. Shemana mehan ma'im shlosh yom kodem Rosh Hashanah. That you withheld water from them for 30 days before Rosh Hashanah. V'shal ba'al shemana mehem shalosh shonos lifnei Rosh Hashanah, or from an irrigated field that you stopped irrigating it 3 irrigation periods before Rosh Hashanah. Harei v'perishishis. These are considered 6-year fruit. But if you kept watering them into this period, they're considered 7th-year produce. So these are type of things that I believe are you're not going to be using them as, because remember when you have food, especially in those days, when you harvested stuff, some of the stuff you ate, but some of the stuff you put aside immediately, and you were going to use those seeds to have seeds to plant the stuff next year, the following year. So I think when you did this stuff, you're not going to be, well, the B'tsalon Hasrisim, they don't have seeds. And the Palamitri, I think because you're drying them out, they're not going to have seeds and stuff. So we're considering that they're done now. So they're done before Shmitta. So even though those are more of a vegetable type of, those are vegetable type foods, it depends when you pick them. But because you stop watering them in the 6th year, they, even though you pick them on Shmitta, they're not considered if they grew during Shmitta, because they needed water and you withheld water. So Rav Kook points out this Mitzri bean, Egyptian bean, it doesn't, whether you planted it so you would have seeds to plant more of it the next year, that the halacha for that is it depends when the fruit is considered complete, or whether you planted it as a vegetable or a legume that you're going to eat it, then it follows when you planted it, because we saw this halacha before. When you stop watering it either 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, this makes it as a seed, not as a food. And the halacha for seed is that you follow when the fruit is completed, not when you gather them. The withholding water from it for 30 days before Rosh Hashanah prepares it to be considered its Gemar Pri. So it's a little different. We don't exactly care. In the other things, it depends when does the fruit develop. For these 2 items, when you stop watering that shows it's done. Because if you wanted to grow more, you'd have to keep on watering it. So from the fact that you stop watering it, that shows that is the time that the fruit is done. And therefore, even though you didn't pick it yet into the 7th year, it's considered that it was 6th-year produce, and you do not have to worry about the Shmitta restrictions. It appears from the Beis Yisrael, which is the Pasuk Shulchan, that this is only true that when you stop watering it 30 days before Rosh Hashanah with the Egyptian bean is when you had planted it to be a vegetable. So when you planted it to be a vegetable, it depends when you pick it. But if you would have originally planted it just as a seed, it always follows when you finish the when it's finished. So this Mishnah only teaches us a halacha when you change your mind. You originally planted it as a vegetable or a legume to eat, and then you stop watering it. Then you're able to change it from being a food plant into a seed crop. And that which these 2 items, these non-seed bearing onions and the Egyptian beans, if you kept watering them into Elul within 30 days of Rosh Hashanah, then they're considered tzvichim. But again, that depends on the machlokas that we've mentioned several times already about tzvichim. So one opinion is if vegetables grew in the 6th year, and we know that they completely grew in the 6th year, you just didn't pick them yet. In the 7th year, they still have the laws of tzvichim, and you're not allowed to pick them. But we already said in Halacha Gimel that there's an opinion that tzvichim is only considered that which it began to grow during Shemitah year. This we know that it all grew in the 6th year. You just didn't pick it yet. Then tzvichim doesn't apply. But for tzvichim to apply, you need that the completion of its growing is in the 7th year. According to that opinion, even if you kept watering these onions and the Egyptian beans, whether you had planted the beans to be a seed or whether you planted them to be a food, since mostly they grew in the 6th year, they're not tzvichim. Whether you hold that tzvichim is only a prohibition to eat or any other stringencies about tzvichim. But they're considered Shmitta produce, but it's not prohibited because of tzvichim. So since they're now considered seeds, so since the ones that are considered seeds are already considered done, or the ones that you were going to eat, you gathered them, you picked them, so they're considered Shmitta produce, but it's not prohibited because of tzvichim. Yod Ches. Any questions? It's just hard because of these different species, and we don't really use them and see how they grow and distinguish between growing them for eating purposes versus. Not the field, but the food that you had picked and was in your house. When it's not, there's a halacha that you're only allowed to eat it as long as it's available in the field for the animals. So that's the biur. That's what you're declaring ownerless. Having your fields ownerless is a separate halacha. The biur is always for the food that you already have in your house because it was already picked.
Oh, I misunderstood. Okay.
Okay. Okay, hadluim, squashes. Some type of gourds or squash. Shekaim and lazera. If you have them, you kept them because you're just going to use them for seeds, meaning you're not going to eat them. If they became hard before Rosh Hashanah, and they're so hard that they're no longer human consumption, fit for human consumption. Motel kamen b'shvius, you're allowed to keep them for Shmitta. Shehemi perashishis, because they are clearly the fruit of the 6th year, because you can't eat them anymore, so they're not Shmitta produce. They were finished in the 6th year. V'im lo, but if they're not that hard, so meaning they're soft enough that humans could still eat them, asur kasvichin shvius, they're prohibited like svichin. V'chein hayrakos kulan, all vegetables shehukshu lifnei Rosh Hashanah. If they became hard before Rosh Hashanah of the beginning of Shmitta, mutar l'kamen b'shvius, you're allowed to keep them on shvius. But if they were soft, also kamen mishum svichim, they're prohibited because of svichim. Ein mechayven osol l'shar shesaluf. We do not obligate people to uproot their wild onions. Ella manicho ba'aretz kamoshahu. You can put it in the ground as they are. Im tzamach l'motzei shvius motor. And if they bloom more in the 8th year, they're permitted. Ve'ein mechayven osol l'shar shesakandas. We do not obligate people to uproot an artichoke plant. So the part that we eat is in the ground, it's under the ground. And that's why onions, it's similar to the onions, because the edible part of the onion, well, with some people, use the green part of onions and put it in salads and stuff, but primarily that. I never looked into that thing I told you about for people who use, let's say, the tops of the beets that are usually not food. I forgot to look into that. Right. So again, we're part of the halacha of using Shmitta produce is you're only allowed to eat the stuff that's normally eaten and eat it in a regular way for its highest and best consumption. But if something is usually animal food, people wouldn't be allowed to eat it. There's a couple minor exceptions, like some type of endive that I guess it was so bitter, because also endives are one of the species from Mara. I mentioned this. So the Yerushalmi mentions that during the other years of the Shmitta cycle, it's inedible and you don't even have to take Truma and Meiser out of it. But during Shmitta or in famine years where they didn't have so much stuff, then they would eat it. So it was only considered a human crop when there was a shortage of other things, which is an interesting concept. Nowadays, we have lots of things that they don't have, and because they don't taste so good, right? Because it's not human food. the people saying, humans don't have teeth that are supposed to chew those properly. But also certain things let's say that there's more bitter varieties, they've selectively breeded and used only the sweeter ones, and after many, many generations, they're not as bitter. So even though they originally wouldn't have been eaten by more people, now they're eaten by a lot more people. So this artichoke, ela gozes ba'alin, you just have to, gozes is like shearing. So you have to snip off the leaves that are growing above the ground. So it seems from this halacha that things that literally are growing under the ground, you could let them keep growing. And why artichokes, you have to cut the tops off so people don't see them growing above ground, I don't know. Okay, Rav Kook says we check the squashes to see if they're so hard that they are no longer fit for human consumption, or if they're not this hard. You take so the ukitz is where it connects to the plant. So you would make a hole at that bottom part. I mean, this is how you check it. If the hole, the thing that you made the hole with, the fruit kind of expanded so you can't really see that hole, then we know that it's soft enough that it's still fit for human consumption. Excuse me, he says the opposite. He says that if it would, right, well, no, yeah, if I just think the words I'm using, I think the idea is if you can't really see where you made the hole, then it's soft enough. And if it doesn't do that, then it's considered hard and it's not fit for human consumption. Okay, what about certain types of fruits that are on these gourds? I don't know what they are, but he calls them dates. That if they became hard, even if they became hard before Shmitta, they're still forbidden to be eaten on Shmitta. And so these aren't real dates. There's some type of date fruits that grow with these squashes, which I don't think are like our squashes. What exactly squashes are they? I don't know. Professor Felix says that they are Liganaria vulgaris. In English, we call it the calabash gourd. So I don't know exactly the flower. So if they, even if they got hard before Shmita, excuse me, even if the gourds themselves became hard, but these berries or whatever would be asur and Shmita, they'd be considered tzvichem, even if the squashes themselves are so hard that they're not considered human consumption. So we treat these berries separate from the gourds themselves. And that is learned from the second chapter, 10th Mishnah of Shvius. And it appears from the Tosos Yantif there that even if these berries themselves got hard, it's still considered tzvichim. We only say that if it get too hard for human consumption, that it's not Shmita, that's only for the guards themselves, but not for the berries. And it appears from the Mishnah Rishona that if the dates themselves got hard, then just like the gourds themselves are mutter if they became hard before Rosh Hashanah, in that case, the berries would be mutter. Excuse me, if the berries would also get hard, then you would be able to use them. They wouldn't be asur tzvichim, except in reality, this usually doesn't happen to berries. So even though the gourds themselves became hard and are mutter, they're not prohibited because of Shmita. We don't say, we still say that the berries are distinct from the squashes or from the gourds. Okay, so what about these berries? So the Rambam, excuse me. Yeah, the Rambam in Parsha Mishnah says, okay, so they are the flowers. Rav Kook does discuss it. So he says they are the flower, and the Rash says they are like some soft branches. And it seems also from the Rambam that okay, so it does appear that it is, because a nate seems to be some type of flower. Okay. In Israel or even here? Here. Okay. Are they big? I don't know about it. I always remember the only time I saw a watermelon field was in Israel, and I thought it was a field of rocks. I'm like, why is there a field with all these rocks in it? I couldn't understand. Then I got closer, I saw they were watermelons. Okay, so the question is, why are these gourds different? So it appears from the Rambam in the second parak of the Mishnayos that when you had these gourds, in order to get seeds from them, Shmita doesn't apply, because Shmita applies to food that you're going to eat, and not for merchandising, and not for seeds. Meaning, if it was food, you wouldn't be able to keep it for seeds, because for Perishvias, because it says the food of the seventh year will be for you to eat. It means you have to eat it. You can't sell it. You can't use it for seeds. So, therefore, if you would have planted regular gourds, you would not be able to save those seeds for the next year. So you had to plant some with the intention that you're going to use those seeds, and you weren't going to eat them. Okay, the Mishnah Rishona says the main prohibition is that you're not allowed to have them after the biur time, because the laws of biur do apply to them if they did not become hard before Rosh Hashanah. But you're allowed to keep them until the biur time, but treat them with kedusha shvius. Okay, now what about a vegetable which is really people don't eat it, but animals eat it? But if you do some type of processing it to eat, then it becomes ruined. Like if you would soak it in water, it would be ruined. Then you're not allowed to soak that thing in water if it was in Shmita, because you are ruining it from being consumed for the animal. Okay. Your test. Loof shaler shvius. Some type of wild onions of the 6th year. Or summer onions of the 6th year. So wild onions are a lower quality. People don't usually grow them. And summer onions are not the usual crop, so they're probably not as good. Also, they would also need to be, you need to water them. So pears, they grow in the summer and they're very dry. So it's as if they were 6th year produce. Upua, which this translator translates it as madder, madder, which is for a dye. We had a different translation when we before. Oh, it is madder. So it's something that's not edible, but it's used for a dye. That finished growing before Shmita, you're allowed to uproot them on Shmita with metal spades, and it's not considered as if you are working the land. So obviously onions are something that grow in the ground. So you would kind of have to dig them up. So you're allowed to dig them up with regular tools, and it's not considered that you're working the land. We saw earlier prakim all these prohibitions against doing things to the land itself, even in the 6th year to prepare for Shmitta. So this is not a problem. Okay, so Rav Kook says, based on the Rash in the 5th chapter of the Mishnayos, the 5th Mishnah, spades, you're allowed to use them, even though they're metal, but you don't usually use spades. Normally, you would use hoes or other things, but not a spade. But it's not, but there's other halachos that for certain things you would have to use something wooden instead of metal. So we still allow you to use a metal, but it's a different tool than you'd usually use. It's not a massive change. It is a change, but it's not a massive change. And Rav Kook says that he feels that this type of change is enough. That's because the shape of the vessel itself looks different. A spade looks different than these other things. Because you don't use something that looks like a spade to do this type of work. So this looks different. I mean, if you use something that looks more like a shovel, even if it's a smaller shovel, a spade doesn't have that digging part. It's more of I would call it more of like a one-armed claw type thing. It's assuming I'm thinking of the right thing. Even though it's the same material that you're using, it's metal, it's made of the same thing that your regular tool is used of. But if you would use these marufos, which really are more like regular shovels, just using wood, that would not be enough for this case. Meaning, because he's saying you could change the tool in 2 ways. You could use the same shaped tool, but make it out of something not as good, using it from wood instead of metal. Or you could use something that's still metal, but it's fundamentally different shape. So he's saying that from this thing, don't think that metal means a small change is enough. He's saying, no, for this thing, it's the shape of the tool that's what's important. So keeping it metal, like the regular tool, is okay. But if you'd have a wooden one that's the same shape as the regular metal one, that's not okay. But this time you made out of wood, that's not okay. And the Mishnah Rishona says that you're allowed to uproot the things that are listed in this Mishnah that grew before Shmitta, and they didn't sprout in Shmitta at all. You could pick them regularly, and using metal spades was the regular way of doing it for a regular year. So he learns, the Mishnah Rishona says that spades was the normal way of doing it. So if they didn't grow at all on Shmitta, you're allowed to do it in the normal way or however you'd want to. The Rash in the 2nd parak Mishnah Hay says that if they grew on Shmitta also, now they're prohibited because of Shvias. So these onions are clearly from the 6th year, but what if but the Rash says if they were sprouting more on Shmitta, then they become also because of Svicha. So we see from these opinions that we're saying, and I'm not criticizing, but the fact that the Chazon Ish allows vegetables to be part of Oter Beis Din is he's relying on very lenient opinions, because we see that a lot of opinions say that if part of the thing grew, now these aren't the regular crops, grew on Shmita, they're prohibited because of Svicha. So again, it seems that the Chazon, that people using, or whether Chazon Ish himself or using things that he said to use it Oter Beis Din is a bit of a chiddush, because he's using some big leniencies. According to the Rash, so if they partially were sprouting on Shmita, you're not allowed. So now they become Svichim because they partially grow on Shmita, and you're not allowed to uproot them at all, because then you're wasting Shmita produce. Because you're not allowed to eat the Shmita produce. And I mean, there's Shmita produce that you're not allowed to eat. There's Shmita produce, but you're not allowed to eat it because of the prohibition of Svichim. And if you would dig it up, then you're causing it to be actively wasted. So you have to just leave it in there and not do anything with it. And the Rash also says that from the fact that you can change them, assuming that they didn't sprout at all during the 7th year. So when you pick them in an unusual manner, you could use spades and not for your regular onion tool that you would harvest onions with. You are partially ruining the vegetables by using the spade. So therefore, you'd only be able to do it and use these spades for fruit that definitely did not. So it's inevitable that you're going to ruin parts of the onions by using the spade. So you can only use them for onions that completely grew the Shmitta and they didn't even sprout at all before Shmitta and didn't sprout at all, because then you'd be destroying Shmitta produce. The Malacha Shlomo says in the name of the Re that if they mostly grew before Shmitta, but they only grew a little bit more on Shmitta, there's no prohibition against picking them, but you just have to treat them like the Shmitta produce. He also says, based on Tosefta, that if these species grew in a rocky place, then you're allowed to pick them regularly because it's not soft earth. They didn't prohibit these type of things. They said you're even allowed to plow that land on Shmitta because it's never going to be nice and soft anyway. If it's a place that they used to plow, because you can't really plant anything there anyway, and only some things grow there occasionally. It's not prohibited because of working the land. Because it's too rocky. Yeah, I guess. Okay. And the Tosos Chadashim says that you always need to pick these in an unusual manner, even if it's a rocky place. You have to still use a shinoi, like using spades and not using the regular onion harvesting tool. The Rash says that this is only for these listed vegetables. You have to pick in an unusual way, meaning because it mentions in these halachos that you could use metal spades. Only these you're allowed to use metal spades for, but other vegetables, and that so this is that these are extra strict that you're not allowed to use the regular tools, but for other things you could use the regular tools. I mean, you could have said, oh, maybe these onions, because they're in the ground, whatever, are special, and you're still allowed to harvest them in the usual way. The Rash learns the exact opposite. These things you're allowed to harvest in the usual way, but in an unusual way. But other vegetables you can harvest in the regular way, as long as you only do a little bit. Because part of Shmitta is you can't act as owner, so you can only harvest a little bit at a time. And the Mishnah Rishona says the opposite, that these are, since these are left in the land and it's good for them, we allowed you to take them out on Shmitta. And we know that when you're taking them out, you're not preparing the land, because everyone knows that you're only using the fruit. You're not preparing the land or getting it ready for plowing. And the reason that you delayed picking them is because it was just keeping them better. But other vegetables, if you keep them in the ground, they're gonna get ruined. So you have to pick them up right away. If you didn't pick them, it shows that when you're using tools, you're trying to work to do something for the land, not just for the fruits. Therefore, you're not allowed to pick other fruits and vegetables on Shmitta through an unusual manner. Except he has more writing on this later on the Kutra Zafra. Let's try to finish halacha 20. Onions. that it rained on them on Shmita, and so these onions seem to have been picked already. Excuse me, they weren't picked, but they were done growing. But then if it rained on them, onions could keep, sprouting new. So if the leaves are green, you're permitted to use them. If they become black, then it's like they're planted in the ground, and then they're also because of svicha. So he says those leaves are prohibited because of svicha. It makes it sound like the onion that's in the ground is still okay. In both cases, the onions themselves that are under the ground are permitted. But the question is, what about the new stalks above? So the new stalks above would be prohibited. So the Rush in the Darim says that only when they became more black than there already is, meaning there has to be a weak green tinge that is tinting towards black. Then we know that they grew more on Shmita and they're prohibited. But if they stay the same color that they were from before Shmita, then if they're yellowish or greenish, so I translated Horiku because Yarok we normally say is green, but in Halacha, it's almost interchangeable. That's Yarok could be yellow or Yarok could be green in Halacha. And that's why sometimes say Yarok Karsi, because a Karsi is like a leek, so it's very green. We know that when the Mishnah says Yarok Karsi, it means green and not yellowish. Because if they're horiku, whether it's the yellowish or the greenish, but not black, we don't know that they grew more on Shmita. The Rash in the Mishnah, in the 6th chapter, Mishnah Gimel says, only when the leaves turned green or yellow, and they shriveled up. So then we know that they finished growing, and then you're allowed to use them on Shmita, because they're considered 6-year produce. So it appears, according to this, that as long as they retain their previous appearance, then it's considered 6. So we don't need to see that if they keep their previous view, then they're considered black and they're usher. Because if they be finished, they shouldn't keep looking the same. If they keep looking the same, it shows that they're still growing. I mean, it may not be getting bigger, but you're still connected to the ground, getting nourishment and stuff. And Tosos in the Dharm there, it appears that they hold that all these signs about black and greenish, when they're the leaves. So that's talking about when we don't know if they were grown, developed mostly in the 6th year or not. Then we look at the color of the stalks that's coming out of the top. That if it's black, it means that most of them that they're fresh and they're growing in Shmita year, and you're not allowed to use them. If they're yellowish, it shows that they mostly grew in the previous year before Rosh Hashanah, and you're allowed to do that. That's only when we don't know otherwise. But if we know that mostly they were grown in the 6th year, it's mutter, according to Tosas. It doesn't matter what the color, even if the stalks are black. And if they're yellow or green, but you know that they mostly grew in Shmita, then they're completely usher. Doesn't matter in the color. Now, when we say that if the stalks are black, or you know that they mostly grew in the 7th year, so this opinion shows that prohibits the entire onion. Not like the first opinion that we mentioned, that the prohibition is only against the new stalks or green stuff or black stuff that came up, and not on the entire onion. So there's a machlokas about that also. And some say that the sign of it being black or green shows that it grew a little bit more on Shmita, but through this little bit of growing on Shmita, it prohibits everything that grew even before Shmita. So therefore, if it's black, if these new leaves are black, the entire onion is prohibited. And some opinion is that this halacha is completely different, that there is a distinction between the onions that are sprouting more, whether they're black or greenish yellow, that we're talking about onions that are still in the ground. But according to the first opinion, we're talking about onions that had already been picked, and then even though you had picked them, you left them on the ground, and then they started sprouting again because it rained. Then if these new stalks are black, it's considered as if they're planted, and those sprouts are prohibited. And if they're the yellowish greenish, then even the yellowish greenish ones are permitted because they're not considered in the ground anymore. But if they were definitely planted in the ground, it all only depends when you pick them. If you pick them during Shmitta, then they are Shmitta produce because it follows regular vegetable. So a lot of different opinions as usual, and find an expert to follow. I believe Wafet Chaf Aleph. Mike, I sent you Sunday's share. Okay.